Revolution Radio proudly presents, live from the heart of the Blue Ridge, Roanoke, Virginia. It's the Just Bernard Show with host Bernard Alvarez. Join Bernard as he shares topics that reveal the real matrix and empower your human experience, including world liberty, the esoteric, suppressed technologies, spiritual ascension, and human consciousness. Humanity has awakened, and our time has come to realize our full potential. And now, live from the Star City, your host, Bernard Alvarez.
I've been really looking forward to today's show with Maya Lynch. I didn't even know that there were Samoan pyramids. Did anybody know there were Samoan pyramids? I had absolutely no idea. So let me tell you a little bit about Maya. Maya was born in Glasgow on the west coast of Scotland. She trained as a computer programmer and worked for 20 years in the advertising industry, first as a digital creative, working for big brands, and then later as a strategist, advising politicians and NGOs. In 2005, she moved to the South Pacific and began working mostly on environmental and human rights causes. This work afforded her the opportunity to travel extensively throughout the Pacific and to visit some of the most enigmatic ancient sites in the region. She has started to publish her research and adventures in the Journey to the Heart of a Lost Empire series, and her first book, The Samoan Pyramid, was released in September 2017 and has become an Amazon #1 bestseller. So without further ado, let me welcome Maya Lynch to the show. Hello, Maya. How are you today?
I'm good, Bernard. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
I'd be doing better if Skype would let us see you. It's not letting us see you. That's
Oh, well,
nothing on your end.
that's a
Don't worry
blessing.
about it. We're very happy we can hear you at least. Thank you, Skype, for ruining all of my settings. I see
sorry.
you. They just can't see you. Let me see if I can at least... I wanted to see if I could... Well, maybe that might help. Let's see. Nope, that didn't help. So
Okay.
what I'm going to do is...
And now, back to your
I'm
host.
going to see if I can pull up your book cover at least, so we can look at that. How's that?
Oh, well, there we go. That's probably a blessing. Yeah.
Anyway, so you are joining us from New Zealand, and I know you're up very early for this. So I want to thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And getting up so early for us. Thank you. So, Maya, tell us a little bit. Let's start at the beginning. What got you so excited about the Samoan pyramids, and what brought you onto this path of creating this work and sharing this work with the rest of the world?
Sure. Well, it's a bit of a strange story, but I'll tell, and you can decide how strange it really is. But when I was, I've listened to your show a lot, Bernard, and I always hear people say things like, oh, when I was a child, I used to get Time magazine and National Geographic, and I always wanted to be an explorer and that kind of thing. But that wasn't really the story with me at all. I was an absolute, if anybody brought up the subject of anything spiritual or religious or anything kind of, UFOs or anything like that, I would kind of excuse myself, leave the room. I just wasn't interested at all, Really was just not turned on, And then the strangest thing happened was a while back, years ago, I was working in the advertising industry. They had this strain of bird flu that went round here and kind of wiped, caught everyone. And I got the bird flu and had this terrible fever. And in that fever, I had one of those vivid waking dreams. And in that dream, which I know this sounds crazy, but in that dream, I was on the Giza Plateau in front of the Great Pyramid, and everyone was running around excited, and people were shouting, "The pyramids are singing! The pyramids are singing!" And when I woke up from that dream, I was laughing when I woke up, and I just knew there and then, right, I'm I'm going to go to Egypt. I knew it was just this immediate understanding that that's what was about to happen next. But I'd had no interest in pyramids or Egypt or anything like that up until this point. And so I started researching, and I came across an interview with John Anthony West, and I thought, well, he seems like a good sort. So I emailed him to ask if he knew, where one should go in Egypt. And he wrote back and said that I should read a book by a guy called Schwaller de Lubitz, but he warned me it's an impenetrable book. He said it's a difficult book to read. So I took that challenge and started reading Schwaller de Lubitz's work, and really that absolutely transformed how I see my place in the world, how I see the world, how I see the whole thing about spirituality and everything like that. I was completely transformed by the work. And then, of course, I went to Egypt, and while I was in Egypt, I met Robert Boval and hung out with him for a while, and I also met Yusuf Awiyan.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, and he gave me this great schooling on. Well, both those guys gave me a great schooling on what the pyramids were all about, and kind of the more esoteric nature of everything. And when I came back from that trip to Egypt, everything had changed. Like absolutely everything had changed. And I went back to work, and I couldn't really. I remember turning to my workmate and asking him, "Is this all there is? Is this it? Is this all there is?" And I was chatting to this guy. I used to work with this guy who worked for the Discovery Channel. He was a video editor, and he because he'd edited documentaries, he had this encyclopedic knowledge of the world. And I was chatting to him one day about the pyramids I'd seen in Egypt and how amazing it all was. And he said, "Oh, well, you want to have a look at Samoa? There's some ancient monuments in Samoa that I'd never heard of." And that was it. There was just that little mention, and it set me on this entirely new path where I started digging into the history books and found some mentions of this ancient monument composed of massive stonework and built by an unknown civilization. And so within a few weeks of first hearing about it, I was on a plane bound for Samoa to try and find a forgotten pyramid. That's how it all started.
That's amazing. And speaking of forgotten, like I said, not many people know about it or even speak about it. And this was this gentleman the first time that you heard about the Samoan pyramid?
Yeah, absolutely. And he hadn't actually heard of the pyramid. He was pointing me in the direction of a different monument entirely. And but yeah, absolutely. The pyramid itself there have been a few archaeological digs there, but nothing. It's never made it into public consciousness.
Yeah.
It's not in the mainstream. And even on the island, it's on the island of Savaii in Samoa. But even on the island, people on that island don't know about it, which is really bizarre. And so yeah, it's missing from the history books. It's not even in the myths, which is weird when you think how Samoa is like very, very traditional and steadfastly aligned to its past. And every bend in the river has a story that goes with it, and has a myth or a legend that goes with it. But this massive construction, which is in the middle of the desert, this massive pyramid complex, doesn't even get a mention. And I just found that utterly bizarre, so I had to go and find it.
I would say so. If I was down there, I'd be looking for it myself.
Well, exactly. It's a total gift. It's an absolute gift. It's like, I remember thinking that when I first heard about it. It's like, there's a pyramid in Samoa and nobody knows who built it. Is probably the greatest gift that I could ever be given. It's exactly what I wanted, exactly what I needed at that time. And as I say, the effect of it has absolutely transformed my life. It's been great.
Now, what island is this on, you said?
So it's on the island of Savaii. So Samoa is made up of many different islands,
right.
And half of those islands are American Samoa, and then half of the islands are what's called used to be called Western Samoa. It's just called Samoa now. And the largest of those islands is the island of Savaii. It's the largest but the least populated. And everybody lives on Savaii. Everybody lives around the outside of the island, kind of on this road called the Coast Road. And in the middle is a volcano, and it's covered in jungle and everything. And the Pulemele, this pyramid complex, is on that volcano, in that jungle. On the island of Savaii.
Now, as I'm looking around, is this the Pulemele Mound, or is that in a different area?
No, that's Pulemele Mound. So this is the weird thing, is that you can Google it, and this is what I did before I went. I Googled the place, and it looks like it's going to be very easy to find, you know? You go, oh yeah, I've seen, some people went there, and there was an archaeological dig in 1963 and another one in 2000. The Thor Heyerdahl Institute funded a dig there in 2002, and whenever the archaeologists went, they cleared the whole area, and they made a road for the archaeologists to go along and everything. Well, because it's in a jungle, it just grows back within a couple of months. The whole thing's covered over. By the time I got there in 2010, it was completely overgrown again. So they've started calling it a mound more recently. From the archaeologists in the 60s, they called it a stone pyramid. So in the Auckland Museum, there's some artifacts that are marked the Pulemele stone pyramid.
Right. Now, I'm looking at a picture of it right now. Is some of the bottom buried underneath, or I mean, how much of it is above the ground? I should ask you.
So it's I'll describe well, maybe I'll go back a little bit,
Yes.
and take a couple of steps back. So,
Okay.
So to get there is really, when I arrived in Samoa, I wanted to. I imagined I'd just get a bus tour. I imagined I'd get there, I'd get on a coach tour. It would take me to the pyramid. I'd look at the pyramid, and then I'd go and sit on the beach for the rest of the week. But what I found when I went to the tourist office was that there are no tours, there's no guides that will take you there, and pretty much if you want to go, you pretty much got to find your own way. Now, in the early 2000s, it was easy enough to get to. Like I say, they'd cleared a path and everything. It was even in the what's that called? The Lonely Planet had an entry in that you could go and see this thing. But what had happened in the intervening period is, because the archaeologists were there and what they were finding out didn't really fit with the local, the Fa'a Samoa, the Samoan way, the Samoan traditions. The archaeologists were finding evidence that the accepted history of the area was incorrect, So lots of that kind of sparked violence and dispute and who owns the land and all that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of trouble. And then in 2010, they made it completely illegal for anybody to go to the site. So to get there, you have to kind of make your own way. I did eventually find a guy that would agree. Well, his sister agreed on his behalf that he would take me, the poor guy, that would take me into the jungle. So you're walking through the jungle. You walk into the jungle, and there's the whole pyramid complex is surrounded by this massive abandoned city, first of all. So you walk through this kind of ancient Polynesian city for a good, for a couple of miles first. And there's like abandoned villages and abandoned, you can see fire pits and walls and ramparts and all that kind of stuff. And eventually you get through the city and up this mountain, up this volcano, you get to where the pyramid complex is. And when you arrive there, there's it's a fitted basalt floor. So if you've ever been to Giza, you've seen those interlocking blocks that surround the pyramids. They kind of interlock like a jigsaw puzzle,
Mm-hmm.
with every block carved to fit the block next to it. So you arrive on there first, so that there's a kind of this massive area that is paved with these massive slabs, and then in the middle you have the pyramid itself, which is a kind of a 3-step pyramid, made entirely out of basalt blocks. It's, if you imagine a football field, it's half the size of a football field, and about the size of a 5-story building. So and that's the main pyramid, and then 50 meters to the north there's a smaller satellite pyramid, I guess you'd call it, and the two are connected by a raised stone walkway. And yeah, like I say, everything's made of black basalt. Yeah, the scale, when you look at a photograph, it's very hard to get a sense of the scale because it's so wide. You know, it's kind of 60 meters wide, 15 meters high. That makes it look quite small, but in reality, it's absolutely massive. You know, when you get there, it's quite overwhelming. It's not the size of the Great Pyramid or anything, but it's still a fairly decent size.
Right. I just want to warn you that I was able to screen share, so we can see you now.
Oh, thank you.
I want to let you know that everyone can see you now. But anyway, and you look great, so don't worry about it. So, I mean, it sounds like, to me, it sounds like it was completely forgotten. And you said that there was no mention of it in their history or their mythology or anything. Nobody knows much about who built it. Do you have a clue, perhaps, or any speculation on the civilization that may have built it and why it was built?
Well, see, that's really interesting, because right now is an amazing time to be working in the Pacific, because all the accepted theory of the accepted history of the Pacific is kind of falling apart, you know, and being reinvigorated, I guess. So what's the accepted theory is that everyone in Polynesia, all the Polynesian people came from one single source. This is the accepted theory, and that single source was a pottery-making culture that came out of Taiwan. Around about 3000 BC, they sailed out of Taiwan, down to Papua New Guinea, then across to Fiji and Tonga and up to Samoa, and then they waited there for a couple of thousand years, and then they went and settled every island in Polynesia. That's still what you get taught at school if you go to school in the Pacific. But what people are finding out now, and the idea that it was always a single point of entry for this one culture, and that culture was already fully formed in Taiwan. Now, the reason behind that is there's a chapter about it in the book, but it's basically that when the first Europeans went into the Pacific, which was in the 1500s, they could not imagine a non-white race establishing an empire at sea. They just couldn't imagine that as a possibility. So they said that it had to have formed on land in Taiwan and then sailed out. So basically they're saying that nothing changed in the Pacific. There was no history. There was no in situ development on the islands. Now that doesn't tie in with the local histories and the oral histories of the islanders. They say that there was all manner of people in the Pacific coming from all different directions, you know. So there's definitely people that came from the north, from kind of what's now Alaska and everything. They say there was people that came from the east, from, you know, Thor Heyerdahl's idea that people drifted from Peru, and also there's this big swathe of people that came from the west. So people came from every direction. That's what the oral histories say. Now, what's been happening just recently is at the University of Otago, which is down in South Island of New Zealand, this Professor Lisa Matisu Smith is doing this incredible work on ancient DNA. So what she did was basically they went and found food middens all along the route that this ancient pottery making culture supposedly took, and they found food middens, and in there they tested the DNA of the rats that they found, the rat bones that they found in the food middens, because people used to eat rats, you know, and basically if you can figure out where the rats came from, then you can figure out where the people came from, because these rats don't swim, so they obviously must have come on a boat with the people, if that makes sense. So she tested this ancient DNA on the rat bones and found that the rats that you get along that route that this ancient pottery making culture people took in the Central Pacific, they all have one lineage. They're all of the same family. But when you go into Polynesia and you look at the rat bones of the rats that people ate in ancient times over there, they came from somewhere else. They didn't come along that route. They're an entirely different family. Yeah. So there's hard evidence now that there was more than one group in the Pacific in ancient times, which is a massive change in the story. You know what I mean? There's a whole new there's a whole missing part of the story.
Obviously,
and,
yeah.
And at Pulemale, at the pyramid, at the Samoan pyramid, what the archaeologists have found was that when the European missionaries, it was the missionaries that arrived in Samoa first in 1830. When the missionaries arrived, the population of the island was about 50,000 people. But when they looked at how much land had been used and land around the pyramid for farming, they said that there's an additional 50,000 people that should have lived there, and so there's this massive group that built a pyramid complex and moved on, and nobody really knows where they came from or where they went. Yeah, and so that's what I've been working on for the past long while, you know. So that was a very long-winded way of telling you that nobody knows who built it.
So nobody, no, but it's a very explanatory way. So thank you for that. Going back again, I know it's probably all just speculation, but you're saying that what I'm hearing is that you're saying that there were probably more than one type of people in the ancient times. Is that what I heard correctly?
That's what the evidence points to, and that's what all the oral histories point to. You know, so it's nice to see science finally backing up the oral histories. You know?
Right, and I mean, it just makes me so curious, even more curious, because we see quote unquote pyramid cultures all around the planet, and to think that somehow a form of it is in Samoa, whether it be a mound or a pyramid, they still have that concept within their culture. And you can't help but wonder where they got it from,
Yeah, I mean that's it. And there are some other interesting things in the islands that would suggest that it's possible that it sprung up independently, but it's very unlikely. There's on one of the other islands there's a place called Fale Olafe'i, which is the House of the Octopus, which is 8 standing stones that are obviously a stellar observatory of some sort, which is real interesting. And there is another mound on one of the islands, but that was dated to the 1700s. So that was built much later, and I think and it's built out of mud and not built out of blocks,
Mm-hmm.
So I think that was a kind of resurgence or a kind of reimagining of this pyramid culture, in the 1700s. It's hard to know. I mean, the interesting thing is with the Samoan stories is that it definitely looks on the surface that there is no mention of it of the pyramid or the pyramid builders when you look at the myths. But in Samoa, they have this orator culture, which is like a storytelling culture, and the orators are really powerful. They are the guys that tell the stories are they're not the king, but they're the advisor to the king, and the technique that the orators use is they'll have one version of a story they call the lower jaw myth, which is the version of the story that everybody gets to hear, and it's told loudly and it's completely acceptable. And then they have the upper jaw version, which is the secret version that only the orators know amongst themselves, and I think it's the upper jaw comes from kind of leaning in to whisper a story, So, in the lower jaw versions, there's no mention of the builders, and in the upper jaw versions of myths, we don't get to know them because we're not orators. They're not going to tell me,
right? Right.
So there may be a version
myth, a hidden story to it. Has anyone or any researcher, including yourself, have they been able to date the pyramid or even the surrounding items around the pyramid?
Yeah. So in 2002, I think it was, there was the Heyerdahl Owl Institute sent a group to research the pyramid, and they wanted to figure out how was it built, when was it built, and give training to local students. Excuse me. And so they managed to date with a fire pit that was kind of over on the western side of the pyramid. They dated to 700 AD that the thing was built. But what was really interesting about that is that the pottery making culture in Samoa that definitely reached Samoa, and everybody assumed, still does, that they were the ones who went on to settle Polynesia. There's evidence for those guys in Samoa from 800 BC up to around 200 AD, and then there's no evidence for them at all. Like, all archaeological evidence just disappears around about 200 AD, and it's like they die out, or they become a very small population compared to what they were. So there's this kind of, the archaeologists call it the Samoan Dark Ages. There's this point where you can almost see in the record that things got real tough on the island. There's this decline in population and then nothing. And then 500 years later, somebody starts building this pyramid. So you get this kind of, this suggestion that it's not a continuous line, you know what I mean? That there is a second group that arrives and starts pyramid building. So yeah, they date it to around 700 AD, based on some carbon that was found in a fire pit next to the pyramid.
Right.
Because you can't date stone,
Yeah. Now, as far, and again, I don't know how much of it would be speculation or if there's been any research on it. I'm interested in the anthropological aspect of the civilization, and I'm just wondering, does the pyramid show any evidence that they had knowledge of any archaeoastronomy? Are there any particular directions involved or placement?
Well, yes. I mean, it's quite masterful when you see the picture on. If you Google Poulet Malay and you see the pictures, people can go, oh, well, that's what's so special about that. But when you realize that the pyramid is aligned to the cardinal directions, so there are kind of stairway ramps on the eastern western sides of the pyramid, and they're aligned to the rising and setting sun on the equinox, which is pretty special, and that shows a knowledge of kind of solar astronomy. And archaeologists and anthropologists always believe that there's a kind of solar that's tough, but stellar observatories much more difficult to achieve. And when you realize that, like I said, there's the main pyramid and then a smaller pyramid to the north and a connecting walkway, and that walkway aligns perfectly to the Southern Cross, which is, you don't see them in the northern hemisphere, but it's a constellation that we see in the southern hemisphere, and it kind of circles around the southern pole, the celestial pole,
right.
And it's like a diamond that kind of, like a kite shape, It's 5 stars actually that kind of rotates around that central point. And when you stand on the smaller pyramid, look directly along the walkway onto the main pyramid, you'll see the Southern Cross at its highest point on the solstice. So
oh wow,
I know it's quite spectacular. And
is it on both solstices or one in particular?
On our summer solstice,
which is our winter solstice up here in the northern hemisphere. Yeah. Not to be confused, people. We're talking southern hemisphere. It's the
we're
opposite.
In the southern hemisphere. Everything's different here. Orion is upside down, and when he's not upside down, he's kind of lying on his side, and so they have completely different images for this for the stars. They like
see the dome of the stars. Yeah.
It's different characters and everything. It's interesting.
And you're kind of describing what the heavens look like. Share with us, and I already showed a picture, but maybe some people are joining late. Could you explain or share with us what you saw when you walked toward the pyramid? What does it feel like? What does it look like when you're approaching the pyramid? So we can get a clearer picture.
So like I said, I'd struggled to find a guide, and there's a couple of chapters at the start of the book about that kind of struggle and why that's difficult and everything. Eventually found this guide, and off we went. I didn't know the guy, and I did have a little kind of panic, what are you doing going into the jungle with this guy? And it was a lot more difficult than I had imagined, and I'm not a marathon runner, but I'm not completely unfit either, but as you're walking through the jungle, so it's hot, it's wet, it's dark, it gets real dense, and then and you're kind of scrambling over logs and trees and all that, and you're doing that for quite some time. There on the way there, we bumped into this guy who didn't, because it's illegal to go there now, which I didn't realize at the time. I didn't know I was breaking the law, but because it's illegal to go there now, there's armed there's guys with guns, in the jungle that
Oh.
are supposed to stop you from going there.
Right.
And so we just bumped into one of those guys and had this massive row just broke out, and everybody's screaming and shouting, and there's guns and knives, and it's all a bit and I just kind of stood in between. My guide was shouting and this guy was shouting, and I kind of stood in between them and just talked about pyramids and why he should let us go, and eventually agreed that we could go, so that was good. And then so you walk through the jungle, and I guess the first thing I noticed was the ground beneath my feet changed from this kind of soaking sludgy mud into something much more solid, and so I kind of moved the leaves and all that kind of stuff away from the jungle, and there was the cobbled streets, ancient cobbled streets that had been built by someone. And so we kind of followed the streets on up through the ancient city, and you can see like big ramparts and it's amazing stuff. And then when you get to the pyramid, and you're just all of a sudden you're in the jungle, and then all of a sudden the pyramid's right there. I mean, the jungle and the pyramid are bang next to each other, right up next to each other, and so you can't really get a sense of how big it is, or you can't see the ends of it. It's just towering up above you, and it's covered in jungle again itself, and there's a tree growing out at the top. There's a big banyan tree that grows in the southeastern corner of the pyramid top, because it's a flat top, it's a 3-step and then a flat top, and it's just this massive majestic thing stuck in the middle of the jungle. Exactly, it's exactly like you would imagine it to be, like a pyramid in the jungle. It's exactly that, which is what's so spectacular about it. And then we kind of clambered up the stairways, and up the eastern stairway, and that brings you up just above the jungle canopy, and you can get a view out across the island and see everywhere you've been walking. You can see the whole, where the city would have stretched to, and everything. Wow. And it's spectacular, yeah. In the middle of the jungle.
In the middle of the jungle, exactly. Wow. Talk about courageous and very brave. Thank you for doing that for us.
I think it's that weird thing about being obsessed with something, is like you get so close that you just have to.
Absolutely. And in the book, you talked a bit about the Lapita people. Were how are they connected, and what do you know about them and how they relate to all of this?
Yeah, so the Lapita people, so that's the pottery making culture that supposedly came out of Taiwan, and they managed to the archaeologists started finding, and it was in the 50s, they started finding this really distinctive red pottery that was decorated. They call it a dentate stamp, which is basically a dog tooth has been taken and stamped into the pottery to make these like stunning geometric patterns, and they found that all the way from New Caledonia, which is over by New Guinea, and all the way through Fiji and Tonga, Samoa, but they expected they'd find it out in Polynesia, because they imagined it was this one sweep of people that went kind of up to Samoa, and then it expanded out into the Eastern Pacific, but they didn't. There is no Lapita pottery any further east than Samoa, so it really does. It kind of looks like these guys who did leave Taiwan and absolutely are part of the story, but they're not the only part of the story, which is what everybody has imagined. Oh, not everybody, which is what academics had imagined up until now, that the Lapita were the one part of the story, and now all parts of Pacific research are coming up with new pieces of evidence to support at least one other group, and who they are. When you, like I say, there's no obvious mention of them in the myths in Samoa, but when you dig into other myths in Micronesia and places, this same story emerges about these guys on every island, and you get this. Basically, what happens is that you get these. Let me just take a step back. What you have in the myths in Micronesia, which is the Western Pacific, what you have there is everybody says that a while back there was this event called the darkness and the cleaving together, and everywhere in the Pacific there's a version of this story. Is that at one point the sky fell to the earth. Basically, the clouds just landed on the surface of the earth, and nobody could see anything, and everything went dark for the longest time. And then, and that story is consistent. They say fire and water fought. So there's like stories of brimstone, that kind of whole idea of burning fire coming from the skies and then hitting into the oceans and big explosions and all that kind of stuff. And all this dust and smoke and steam and everything goes up and everything's blanketed in cloud. Now that story is consistent right throughout the Pacific, to the point that it's either true or it's an extremely widely held belief. Then what happens is, as in each region there's a local variation of this, but a local hero emerges and lifts up the sky. So the most famous one is Maui, that pushes up the sky. In New Zealand, we've got a guy leans on his back and he pushes up the sky. In Kiribati, there's a version of a little dwarf guy called Na'arau that does some magic and lifts up the sky. Everywhere across the clouds lift. Everywhere across the Pacific, the clouds lift, and light comes back to the Pacific again. Now, it's me just getting around to tell you what happens at that point is in the Micronesian myths. Is they say that the people that were kind of left after this, there was this really small, like there was people that were physically small, called, and they were in one group called the Spider Clan, and these people that were really, really physically big, and they were in this group called the Bird Clan. And I don't want to get into too much detail, but basically those two groups joined together and formed this mega clan. And then in the myths, they go on together, these really big people and these really small people work together to settle all the islands of the Pacific. And I think that's probably more like what happened than the academic theory.
Right. Well, you're getting it from the source, actually, when you're listening to those stories.
Well, exactly. I
would think. Very interesting. Now, you talked that in your book, you talk about how Pulamele, am I saying that correctly?
It's close enough, Bernard.
Okay.
Pulamele.
Pulamele has
Yeah.
energetics to it. How did you measure them, and what does this signify to you?
Well, yes. So the energetics, I experienced them in the strangest possible way. So basically, we'd climbed up to the top of the pyramid, and I was on the top trying to measure the alignments and that kind of thing. And my guide Baba had gone and sat. He was sitting under the banyan tree on the southeastern corner, and as I was walking around the top of the pyramid, my compass was it was fine if I stood in the center of the pyramid, but whenever I moved to either side, it just started spinning wildly and giving readings that I knew were incorrect. And then the weirdest thing was, like, I started having difficulty breathing. I couldn't breathe properly, and I started getting real kind of angry and frustrated, and then this really strange feeling of dread and impending doom. I thought, it's the hardest thing to describe. It was this really, really horrible feeling, like horrible. And then I started getting these weird, like, flashes that were inside my eye, like flashes of light, like purple light and then orange light, but really rapid, like one after the other. And like I say, my breathing was weird, and I was kind of take it easy and try and calm down and top myself around. I started to get really overwhelmed by everything, and as soon as I kind of topped myself around and said, "Are you just imagining this?" blah blah blah, the whole thing would start again, flashing lights and feeling terrible and all that kind of stuff. And so that lasted for a few hours, and maybe like 6 hours or something, and feeling awful. Still trying to do what I was there to do, but just this rising sense of terror, dread, horrible. And so eventually I said, look, we got to go. You know what I mean? We got to get out of here. So we left, and I kind of wondered, what was that all about? So when I got back, I went to see an optician. I went to see my optician to ask her if she knew anything about it, what the flashing lights could possibly be. And so she gave a bunch of possibilities, exertion, which is obvious. You know what I mean? I've been walking and I'm not the fittest person. Lack of water because we'd run out of water, and then she said the only time she's seen it other than that was in an MRI machine, which is the magnetic imager they have in hospital and on those kind of hospital dramas, the MRI machine, the one that spins around people. And she says that as the magnets spin round, that's the kind of thing that people can get that flashing light. And so I thought, well, that's really interesting, because I know that basalt is naturally magnetic, So and I thought that could go some way to explaining why the compass was spinning, and possibly some way to explaining this weird ocular phenomena that they call magnetophosphenes. They call it, like, phosphenes are when you rub your eyes and you get those sparkles on your eyes.
Yeah.
Well, magnetophosphenes are ones caused by magnets. Anyway, and then I was so I did, I thought maybe that's a possible explanation. And then I saw an interview with a guy called John Burke, who was a really interesting, he's passed away now sadly, but a really interesting researcher from, I think he's from Boston. And he was taking electromagnetometers, I think they're called, to different sites like Silbury Hill, Stonehenge, Tikal. He went to a whole bunch of different sites, Gunjawamp, to measure their electromagnetic, measure electromagnetism at the sites.
Right.
And he found that during the day, the kind of electromagnetism would rise and fall. As dawn came up, it would rise and then be strong up until kind of early afternoon, and then it would fall at night. And that he believed anyway that this was why ancient people had built these structures. And the interesting, so I looked more into Pulemale, where it was built and how it was built. And the interesting thing is that it's built on a volcano, right? But also on top of an aquifer, which an aquifer is underground running water, the water that goes through rocks. Now, as the water goes through those rocks, something really interesting happens is that as it's put under different varying degrees of pressure, an electron from the water molecule is kind of scraped off the water molecule and left on the rock, which makes the water positively charged and the rock negatively charged. And entirely naturally, an electric potential starts to stream between the two of them, because one's positive and one's negatively charged. And when you look at all the ancient sites, Giza, Tikal, all around the world, when you look at ancient pyramid sites, every single one is built on top of an aquifer or on top of a man-made aquifer.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was very, that's a kind of interesting thing in it kind of points to some electromagnetic purpose for it. But then I found this research by these two guys called Clark and DeBiran, and they were, I think, funded by the Heyerdahl Institute as well. And what they discovered when they went to Pulemale, they took a GPRS machine to put radar waves down inside the pyramid and see if there was any chambers or anything like that inside. And they found that it wasn't. It's kind of built out of solid blocks. There were no chambers inside. But when at the point where the pyramid base meets the ground, they call it the mound-ground interface, at that point there's this interesting thing called a reverse polarity. Now, a reverse polarity, if you've ever held two magnets and tried to push them together and have them push apart,
Right.
That's a reverse polarity. So the pyramid and the ground are doing that thing like magnets do, that kind of push each other apart, So at a molecular level, at least, the pyramid floats.
Oh, I see.
Which is bizarre,
Very bizarre. Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, I wonder why they would. Well, I wonder if they knew about these electromagnetic effects that they were creating and or putting the structure there on purpose, And what would be the purpose of the pyramid? I understand that perhaps there were no graves or anything like that,
Yeah.
according to your research. What's your speculation or hypothesis on what this structure is all about?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to take into account where it was built, the fact that it's built on top of an aquifer, the fact that this strange electromagnetic, natural electromagnetism happens at that site. You have to say it was built there probably because of that. Otherwise, you're just saying that it's entirely by accident, and you don't give enough credit to the people that built it. I think, you know?
Right. Yeah, I don't believe in coincidence.
Yeah, you know. I mean, because everything else is, it's aligned to the cardinal directions and aligned to the Southern Cross on the solstice. So to say it was just built there by accident just seems crazy, you know. The actual purpose of it, like you say, there's been multiple digs looking for graves or any evidence of a grave, and they've found none. The local villagers do say that their chief from the 1700s, one of their chiefs was buried there, but nobody's been able to find that grave yet, you know. But as to what went on there, you know, who knows? I mean, some myths, but in Kiribati, so like days sailing away, you know what I mean? On another island, they talk about a boat shed in Samoa, and I often wonder if that is the same place, if they're referring to that, because they talk about this boat shed that was built in the jungle, and I just wonder if they're talking about Pulamile, but it's a long boat stretch,
Right,
you know?
right.
But as to the purpose of it, your guess is as good as mine right now, and that's the God's honest truth.
Well, you know, I get excited just thinking about the way it affected your consciousness, and I wonder if maybe something that had something to do with ritual or some type of psycho-spiritual experience that they created intentionally. Who knows?
Yeah, yeah.
You know, we're talking about, we were talking a little bit earlier about the myths and whatnot, and as we're speculating, I'm wondering, what are your thoughts in relation to the myths and or the belief in Lemuria and or Mu? What are there any connections there to you as an observer?
So that a few people have asked me that question about, and I'll put my hand up and say I didn't really know anything about Lemuria or anything before that point. Before people started asking me about it, so I thought I'd best look it up at least, you know. And there is something kind of interesting, is that so the whole concept of Lemuria came about as there was a scientist trying to explain why there are lemurs in Madagascar, why there's this one genus of lemurs that live in Madagascar, but they don't. How did they get to that island? You know, it must have come from a sunken continent that was connected. How are lemurs on Madagascar? That's how that whole concept in modern science emerged. You know, and the weird thing is like Madagascar. That's a tiny island over by, you know, the east side of Africa, the southeast side of Africa, in the Indian Ocean. Polynesia, Pacific. It's an entirely different ocean around the other side of the world, but in the Pacific, the language they speak is it's called the Austronesian language group. You know, everybody speaks an Austronesian language. The only other place that people speak an Austronesian language is Madagascar, and it's around the other side of the planet. You know,
I never knew that. Very interesting.
Yeah, so there's definitely something there. And in the ancient myths in the Pacific, there isn't anywhere that they refer to as Lemuria, but they do talk about a place called Hawaii, which is often kind of mixed up with the afterlife, or you know, the underworld as well. So there's a kind of mythical place, but it's also a real place where people came from, and that's where everybody was before the sky fell down and everything turned dark. You know, which I think was a real event. I'm pretty, because it's so consistent right throughout the Pacific that this event happened, that it seems strange that it wouldn't be real.
And so many other cultures speak of some type of cataclysm. You know, we talk about we had Brian Forrester on a couple of weeks ago, and I think
Yeah,
was it last year or earlier this year he wrote out that book about the great cataclysms that
yeah,
are spoken of in South America. So there's got to be something. I mean, you know, we have it in the Bible as well. You know, the Great Flood and whatnot. So
yeah,
there's
yeah,
got to be some truth to all these mythological, quote unquote, mythological stories that we hear. And
yeah.
it's just so fascinating for me as an individual and a researcher in alternative, or shall I say, reevaluating history, to
Well,
find this kind of information that you've discovered. It's just fascinating.
the whole thing about myths is that, um, in the Western world, Romans, Greeks, they developed writing. You know, they had writing, so they could write their histories down. You know, but in the Pacific, there was no writing until no real writing system that we know of. So it makes complete sense that their myths would contain history. You know, whereas in the
Yeah.
Greco-Roman thing, they didn't have to because they had libraries and all that kind of thing. They could write their history down. But everybody knows that the context of an oral history that there are truths. Now it may be told in a fantastical way, you know what I mean, and you may have the same superhuman guy doing all the different feats and
Right.
adventures, and in reality it was different people at different times. But there's a big chunk of truth in there, you know.
Yes, I would think it's all inspired from truth in one sense or
Yeah.
another, as you say. Now we need to start wrapping up, but I'm
Oh,
wondering with your book and the intention of why you wrote the book. And I mean, again, what a fascinating story. What do you want the readers to get from your book? What do you think that we can take away from it? Being that we weren't there with you and couldn't
yeah.
experience such a wonderful experience, what can readers take away from your book, or what do you
Um.
want them to? I should say.
Well, I hope I get a lot of feedback that people really enjoy. It's written in first person. You're there the entire time. You're seeing everything kind of as it unfolds for me, you know. And the book, the timeline of the book is in over in one week, and but it also tells 5,000 years of history, kind of jumping back and forward. It's a short read. It's a quick read. It's hopefully a fun read. I think that lots of people are enjoying it. But the thing that, if there was a political piece to the book, then I would hope that what could be achieved is that people know about the pyramid first of all and start. I mean, that's the main thing, is that up until this point, it's not in the public consciousness at all, and it's the largest ancient monument in the whole of the Pacific, and nobody talks about it. And that in itself, I think that probably needs to change, and help get an understanding of who we are, what is our real history, you know. So I'd say, number one, for people to be conscious, there's a pyramid in Samoa and nobody knows who built it. And the second thing would be to get the site the protection it deserves. At the moment, it's completely abandoned,
Oh no.
overgrown,
Yeah.
and just and going to wreck and ruin. And the United Nations, UNESCO, looked at the possibility of making it a World Heritage Centre, but because of multiple different political problems, ownership claims, that kind of stuff, that they weren't able to do anything. And so at the moment, it's just kind of stuck in this weird. Nobody's allowed to go there, and nobody talks about it. It's stuck in this weird kind of limbo at the moment.
Like a protective limbo.
Yeah, and nature is reclaiming the site.
Oh, that's not good. Well,
Yeah.
where can people find your book?
So they can. The book is on Amazon.com.
Of course.
It's
Cool.
called The Samoan Pyramid, or so they can jump on there and get it. Or if you go to my website, mayalynch.com, MAYALYNCH.com, you can sign up for my newsletter, and you get like the first 4 chapters of the book, just for signing up. And I send out emails probably every month-ish on new research and things like that. So yeah, either one of those places. Yeah.
That's great. And I'm wondering, I know we mentioned it at the very beginning, but could you expand a little bit on what is a journey to the heart of the Lost Empire?
Sure. So so the Journey to the Heart of the Lost Empire is I'm planning to write I am writing a series of books that kind of the first book is this look at the Samoan pyramid. The second book is what happened after that. So I'm kind of on the trail of the pyramid builders and traveled all throughout Micronesia. So there's that adventure, and then I hope to go to South America, to Peru, and specifically, and I'll look at the kind of cactus cults that were in Peru in ancient times, and just kind of, like I say, the history we have of the Pacific is this kind of this kind of Western view that it was this one group that couldn't get their act together and nothing really happened in the Pacific. But when you look at all the evidence, the megalithic structures in the Pacific, you know that there was a megalithic empire there, and the series is just about kind of rediscovering that history.
That sounds fantastic. Well, I thank you so much for joining us today, Maya, and thank you for being patient with Skype.
Technology. Thank you, Bernardo.
It has been fantastic, and I am so grateful that we got to spend this time with you and learn so much, quite honestly. Let me see if I can get my camera back on. Here we go. Anyway, thank you, everybody. Thank you for, again, being patient with our technological issues. I just want to let you all know that next week we are going to be joined by Jordan Sather. I hope I'm saying that correct. He's from YouTube, a fellow YouTube creator. He's been all over the truth consciousness movement. He's on Destroying the Illusion on YouTube. Anyway, I'm looking forward to having him join us on the show. I love you, everyone. Have a wonderful week. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.